They forgot him in space. Not for a day, not for a week, for 10 months, while he orbited 250 miles above the planet at 17,500 miles per hour. The country that sent him up there quietly stopped existing. The flag on his shoulder was retired. The city he was born in was renamed. His paycheck stopped clearing. And the people who were supposed to bring him home spent the winter arguing about which of the new governments below was on the hook for the gas money. This is the story of a man who became the last citizen of a country that disappeared while he was looking the other way. In May of 1991, the Soviet Union was still a nation. Cracking, yes. Wobbling, yes. But on paper, still the second superpower on Earth. Still flying cosmonauts. Still operating the most ambitious space station humanity had ever built. The Mir space station was the crown jewel of that program. A chain of pressurized modules bolted together about 250 miles above the surface, orbiting the Earth at roughly 17,500 miles per hour. Mir means peace, or world, depending on how you translate it. By the end of 1991, neither word would describe what was happening below. Picture the station itself. Mir was not the gleaming white architecture you see in movies. It was a cramped, cluttered, lived-in workshop that smelled like a basement furnace room. The total habitable space inside was about as big as the inside of a Greyhound bus, split across multiple modules, connected by hatches barely wide enough for a grown man to push through with a piece of equipment. Cables snaked along the walls. Velcro patches held everything in place because gravity wasn't going to. There was a small toilet that worked roughly half the time. There was a treadmill bolted to a wall. There was a window the size of a dinner plate. And that window was the most prized real estate in low Earth orbit. Sergei Krikalev was 32 years old, a flight engineer, a mechanical engineer by training. Sharp, unflappable. The kind of man you want sitting next to you when something starts beeping that isn't supposed to beep. He had already spent 151 days on Mir during a previous mission. He knew the station the way a long-haul trucker knows his rig. Every cable, every hatch, every weird smell that meant a fan was about to fail. So when the program needed someone to fly a 5-month mission with a British guest astronaut and a Kazakh research cosmonaut, Krikalev was the obvious choice. The launch was textbook. Soyuz TM-12 lifted off on May 18, 1991, from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in what was then Soviet Kazakhstan. Krikalev arrived at Mir, settled in, and got to work. The plan was simple. 5 months. A relief crew would arrive in October. He'd come home in the fall, hug his wife and his 1-year-old daughter, and start writing his report. That plan died in August. While Krikalev was floating through the corridors of Mir, the Soviet Union began to come apart underneath him. On August 19th, hardliners in Moscow attempted a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. Tanks rolled into Red Square. For 3 days, nobody on the ground or in space knew who was actually in charge of the country. Krikalev was woken up by his commander and told what was happening. He could see Moscow from orbit. He could not see the politics. He kept working. Think about what that view actually meant. Every 90 minutes, the station completed a full orbit. Every 90 minutes, Mir crossed over the European part of the country. From his window, Krikalev could see the lights of Moscow at night, the glow of the Kremlin, the dark serpentine of the Moskva River winding through the city. He could see the city where, somewhere in those streets, the future of his nation was being decided by men with guns and arguing generals. He had no real-time news feed. He had short professional voice loops with mission control, where the controllers did their best to keep things calm and routine. They were trained to keep cosmonauts focused on the work in front of them, not the chaos below. So when Krikalev asked what was happening, he got measured, careful answers. He learned to read between the silences.
The coup failed in 3 days. The Soviet Union failed slower, but it failed all the same. The first hint that something was wrong with his return came in October. The relief crew arrived as planned, carrying that British astronaut and the Kazakh research cosmonaut who had been added to the mission for political reasons. Kazakhstan, suddenly nervous about its future inside a crumbling union, wanted one of its own people in space. Fast. So they slotted in a Kazakh cosmonaut, Tokhtar Albakirov, on a 1-week visit. The math of that decision matters. To make room for Albakirov on the launch and the return, the Soviets had to bump someone else off the manifest. The flight engineer who was supposed to relieve Krikalev was that someone. There was no replacement. There was no money to train one. The cosmonauts who would have flown to take Krikalev's place were now sitting in their barracks while the agency that paid them argued with itself about which government still existed. So when the relief Soyuz undocked in October and headed back to Earth, Krikalev was still on Mir, alone with his commander, Anatoly Artsebarsky, and a mission that had quietly stopped having an end date. Artsebarsky did go home, on schedule with the visiting crew. The new commander, Alexander Volkov, came up to replace him. But Krikalev stayed. He was told the next ride home was now scheduled for March of 1992. He had launched in May of 1991. The math wasn't subtle. He agreed to extend his mission. What choice did he have? The alternative was to leave Mir empty, and an empty space station in 1991 was not just a research facility going dark. It was a 100-ton symbol of national prestige tumbling through orbit with no one minding the store. He stayed. Then, on December 26, 1991, while Krikalev was still 250 miles above the planet, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. 15 new countries appeared in its place overnight. The hammer and sickle came down over the Kremlin. The red flag was replaced. And the cosmonaut in low Earth orbit, the man who had launched as a Soviet citizen on a Soviet rocket from a Soviet cosmodrome, suddenly belonged to a country that no longer appeared on any map. Imagine the disorientation of that moment. You are alone in a metal tube the size of a school bus, hurtling around the planet at 5 miles per second, and somebody on the radio tells you, almost in passing, that your country has been deleted. Your hometown of Leningrad is now called Saint Petersburg again, the name it had before the revolution. The cosmodrome you launched from is no longer in your country. It's in Kazakhstan, a foreign nation that now charges rent. Your mission control in Korolyov is technically still working, but the agency above it doesn't have a name anymore, and nobody is sure who pays the salaries. Krikalev kept doing his job. He ran experiments. He fixed broken equipment, of which there was a lot. Mir was an aging station, full of cranky systems that needed constant attention. He logged data. He talked to ham radio operators on the surface in the few minutes a day his orbit passed over receivers. They reported that he sounded calm. Tired, but calm. The repairs alone could have been a full-time job for 2 men. The carbon dioxide scrubbers needed cleaning. The water recycler had a habit of throwing fault codes at 3 in the morning, station time. A solar panel motor stuck once and had to be coaxed back to life through a sequence of commands that took hours to execute. The toilet, That small but critical piece of hardware broke more than once and had to be repaired with parts that were never designed to be field serviced by a man wearing socks in zero gravity. None of this was glamorous. None of this made the news. But it was the daily reality of keeping a 100-ton space station alive on a shoestring, and Krikalev did most of it himself for months on end. Calmness was a choice. Up there, he had problems no cosmonaut had ever had to think about before. The new Russian government was broke. Not metaphorically broke. Actually, factually, can't pay the electric bill broke. The space program's budget had collapsed. Engineers at Mission Control were going months without paychecks. Some were quietly looking for jobs elsewhere. The factories that built the Soyuz capsules were running out of parts. Suppliers wanted to be paid in hard currency, not rubles, because the ruble was crashing. There was open talk in Moscow about whether Russia could even afford a manned space program at all. And in the middle of all of this, the question hung in the air like a bad smell. Who was going to bring Sergei home? The answer that emerged was almost surreal. Germany paid. Austria paid. Each country wanted to send their own astronaut to Mir for a week-long visit, and each was willing to hand over millions of dollars in hard currency for the privilege. Those payments kept the lights on at Russian Mission Control. Those payments funded the next Soyuz launch. The cosmonaut, stranded in orbit because the Soviet Union collapsed, was, in effect, going to be rescued by foreign cash. Klaus Dietrich Flade, a German Air Force officer, would fly up in March 1992, along with the cosmonauts who would finally bring Krikalev home. Klaus had a one-week mission. Krikalev had a homecoming, but the wait was not gentle. Krikalev's body was paying interest on every additional day in orbit. Spaceflight is brutal in ways that don't show up in the heroic photos. In zero gravity, your bones stop working for a living. The skeleton, which on Earth has to fight gravity every second of every day, suddenly has nothing to push against. Bone density drops by about 1 to 2% per month. Over 10 months, that's like aging into your 70s in skeletal terms. Muscles atrophy fast, especially the postural ones in the back and legs that you don't realize you're using until you can't. The heart, freed from the work of pumping blood up against gravity, gets lazy. It actually shrinks. By the time Krikalev came home, his heart was measurably smaller than when he left. His blood was going haywire too. In space, fluids drift up toward the head. Faces puff, legs thin. The body, sensing too much blood pooled in the upper torso, decides it has too much blood overall and starts dumping it. Astronauts return with measurably less blood plasma than they left with. That's why the first thing they do after landing is drink salt water. They are, in a real sense, dehydrated by their own physiology. And then there was radiation. Above the bulk of Earth's atmosphere, the human body absorbs cosmic and solar radiation at a rate that would set off alarms in any nuclear plant on Earth. Over 311 days, Krikalev absorbed something close to the radiation dose of roughly 8,000 chest X-rays. Not lethal, but not nothing either. It increases lifetime cancer risk in measurable ways, and there is no shielding it. The walls of Mir were aluminum a few inches thick, which against the highest energy particles in the universe is like trying to stop a bullet with cardboard. There was also the psychology of it. Picture his routine. He woke up to the same beige walls every day. He ate the same dehydrated meals. He smelled the same recycled air, which on Mir had a particular reputation. A mix of body odor, ozone, electrical components, and decades of accumulated funk that veteran cosmonauts described as somewhere between a locker room and a basement. He looked out the window and saw the planet his daughter was growing up on, and he could not touch any part of it. He could see his hometown pass beneath him every few orbits. He could see the lights of Moscow, the city where his bosses were arguing about whether he existed politically. And he could not get down. A typical Mir crew rotated every 5 to 6 months for a reason. Beyond that, the psychological data got murky. Isolation studies on Earth, in Antarctic bases and submarine deployments, suggest that humans handle confinement well for a stretch and then start to fray. Sleep degrades. Small irritations become large ones. The crew above had to manage that fraying with no off-ramp. Back on the ground, his wife was managing a different kind of stress. She was raising their daughter alone, in a city whose name was changing, in a country whose name was changing, with the news every night carrying images of empty store shelves and protesters in the streets. Cosmonauts' families have always lived with the possibility that something might go wrong in orbit. They have not, historically, lived with the possibility that the country tasked with bringing their loved one home might cease to exist mid-mission. She did interviews. She kept a brave face. She told reporters her husband was strong, that he understood why the delay was happening, that they would be reunited. What she said in private, to friends, to her own mother, is not on record. It does not have to be. Volkov, the commander who had come up to replace Artsebarsky, became Krikalev's primary companion for most of the long stay. The two of them, alone in the station for months, they got along, they worked, they watched Earth. In one ham radio conversation, Krikalev was asked if he wanted to come home early. He said no. He said leaving the station empty would damage the program he had spent his career building, and that as long as he was up there, he would do his job. The ham radio operator told him he was a hero. Krikalev, in his characteristic deadpan, replied that heroism was when you had no choice. He had a choice. He was just doing his work. Down on Earth, the politics around his return got uglier the longer it stretched. Ukraine, newly independent, was claiming pieces of the old Soviet space program. Kazakhstan was demanding rent on the Cosmodrome. Russia was holding the bag on the actual missions and the actual people in orbit, and writing checks it could not cover. The relationships between the new republics were knife-edge tense. There were real fears in Moscow that one of the new governments might block a launch out of spite or as a bargaining chip. None did. But the fact that the worry existed at all, that the safe return of a man in orbit could become a chess piece in a divorce settlement between countries, tells you everything about the era. Finally, on March 17, 1992, Soyuz TM-12 launched from Baikonur. It carried Klaus-Dietrich Fleder, the German, and 2 Russian cosmonauts to relieve Krikalev and Volkov. After a brief handover, Krikalev climbed into the older Soyuz TM-13 and undocked. The descent was the standard Soyuz return, brutal in its own way. The capsule re-enters the atmosphere at about 17,000 miles per hour, and the heat shield outside reaches temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Inside, the cosmonauts are pressed into their seats by deceleration forces of 4 to 5 Gs. After 10 months of weightlessness, 4 Gs feels like having a refrigerator dropped on your chest. Your muscles, which have forgotten how to fight gravity, scream. Your inner ear, which has spent a year being lied to, panics. The capsule fired its retro rockets in the final seconds before touchdown and slammed into the Kazakh steppe on March 25, 1992. Krikalev had been gone 311 days. His country, the one printed on his launch papers, had been gone for about 3 months. Recovery teams pulled him from the capsule. He could not stand. Nobody could after that long in 0 G. They carried him out on a stretcher. He was pale, slack, the way deep space veterans always look in those first hours, like a man who has been pulled out of a deep well. Later footage shows him sitting in a folding chair on the open step, wrapped in a thick blanket, blinking up at a sky that was now, finally, the right side of the atmosphere. The sensations of that first hour back on Earth are something only long-duration astronauts can describe. The weight of his own head felt like a bowling ball balanced on a stack of straws. His arms had to be lifted, not raised. His skin, which hadn't been touched by sunlight or a real breeze in 311 days, registered the cold steppe air like an electric shock. The smell of grass, of dirt, of things that grew, hit him so hard that several cosmonauts in similar situations have said the same thing in their memoirs. Earth has a smell. You don't notice it until you've been gone long enough to lose it. Coming back, you smell it before you feel anything else. The country he came back to was not the country he had left. The grocery stores in Saint Petersburg were half empty. Inflation was eating his savings in real time. His paycheck, when it came, was paid in a currency worth less than the paper it was printed on. The ranks on his uniform were from a military that no longer existed. Eventually, he would be issued new documents, new ID, a new flag patch. The Russian Federation flag, the white, blue, and red. He would fly again, twice on the space shuttle. Once to the International Space Station, where in 2000 he became part of the very first long-duration crew, the man who turned the lights on in humanity's permanent home in orbit. By the time he retired, he had spent over 800 days in space, more than any other human being for years. The stranded cosmonaut became one of the most experienced astronauts who ever lived. But the 311 days are what people remember. There's something almost myth-like about it when you sit with it. A man rises into the sky on behalf of a great power and looks down to find that the ground itself has rewritten its own name underneath him. The borders he knew are gone. The anthem he launched to is gone. The flag he saluted is gone. And the only thing keeping him in the sky, in a fragile metal shell going 5 miles a second, is the residual momentum of a country that no longer exists, kept aloft by foreign money and the stubbornness of engineers who weren't being paid. When you watch interviews with him about that mission, decades later, he doesn't dramatize it. He shrugs. He says it was a complicated time. He says everyone was doing the best they could. He talks about Mir the way a sailor talks about an old ship, with a quiet, exasperated affection. But he also says one thing that always lingers. He says that from up there, looking down, you can't see the borders, you can't see the flags. You can see rivers, you can see deserts, mountains, the green smear of forests, the grey bruises of cities. You can see weather systems chewing across continents. You cannot see where one country ends and another begins. The lines that mattered so desperately to the people on the ground, the lines that erased his nation while he slept, did not exist when seen from where he was. Maybe that's the strange gift of his ordeal. To be the last citizen of a country that vanished while you orbited above it, and to come home to a planet where, from a certain altitude, no country has ever really existed at all. Mir, the station, the word for peace, kept turning above a world that couldn't agree on its own borders. And inside it, a quiet, unflappable man kept showing up for work, watching everything change while nothing changed, until they finally remembered to bring him down. The Soviet Union got 311 more days of human spaceflight than it deserved. Sergei Krikalev gave it to them, and then he came home to a different country, a different flag, and a body that would carry the cost for the rest of his life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.